Welcome back. We're eager to get going with the rest of the program, so let's jump in. This morning, we've already heard from thought leaders and policymakers on religious liberty, and now we'll hear from the boots on the ground. Our Interfaith Roundtable features a great lineup of local community leaders who deal with these issues in their day-to-day lives. These women and men see where the rubber hits the road, so we're excited to get their perspective on religious liberty. But before we begin, I wanted to excuse Bishop Oscar Solis from the Catholic Diocese. He was unable to attend due to commitments for preparations for Holy Week. Still, he sends his sincere gratitude to the Foundation for the invitation to participate and his warmest regards to everyone here. We actually just saw him yesterday, and he was really wishing he could be here. Now, let me quickly introduce each of the members on our panel. You, of course, know Baroness Nicholson, Professor Scharfs, and Leonard Leo from their earlier remarks. Joining us today, we also have Mr. Awais Ahmed, the chairman of the Utah Muslim Civic League and an active member of the Islamic Society of Greater Salt Lake. Elder Jack N. Gerard, a member of the Quorum of the 70 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Dr. Neil Neelamagam, a founding trustee of the Sri Ganesha Hindu Temple in the Salt Lake Valley. Ms. Pamela Atkinson, an elder in the First Presbyterian Church and a well-known advocate for Utah's less fortunate. In fact, the reason why she was running behind is because she was helping the homeless. And Rabbi Avremi Zippel, the director of Young Jewish Professionals for Chabad Lubavitch of Utah. Now, with those brief introductions, let's get started. And I want to say, this is not going to be structured. We're not going to, we've had the structured portion of the event. I want this to be much more organic. I want you all to feel free to jump in if you have a comment. And I don't, we come from the Senate, so you can speak as long as you would like until you start seeing people glaze over. But don't feel constrained by the time. We want you to be able to share and speak and do. So Neil, let's begin with you. Just to start off, in speaking with you ahead of this program, you shared what a wonderful relationship you enjoy with many faiths in this area. And what I wanted to hear from you, and we'd like to have others weigh in, is what advice would you give to others here in the room or here on the panel who are struggling with connecting with others of other faiths?
Thank you for the query, Mr. Sandgren. I would also like to thank the Hatch Foundation, Senator Hatch.
Is the microphone on there?
Symposium. I've written the answers, so I'm going to read the answers. It's much easier so that I don't make mistakes. The state of Utah believes in the core principles of religious liberty. The Winter Olympics of 2002 enhanced the different interfaith groups of Christian denominations of the past. They were interfaith groups. They were mainly Christian denominations. 2002 brought other religions into that fore. Then Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable was created at that time. And there are other roundtables in Provo, Utah Valley Interfaith Group, and there's one in Tuala and other places. There's a student group called Coexist. So these are the interfaith groups in Utah that promote dialogue among different religious belief people. Anybody can join them. The information is available on the internet.
Great, thank you. Elder Gerard, you look like you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to add to what was said earlier, and to thank you, Matt, and particularly Senator Hatch, for bringing us together. To your question of how do we facilitate these dialogues, I think this is a perfect example as to how we come together, because there's a lot more we agree on than we disagree on. We've all got our various doctrines and traditions and principles associated with our theology, our faith, but fundamentally we're all in this conversation together. Because as part of our doctrine, as we protect our interest in religious liberty, it should be equally protective of all those here and many others that aren't with us today. And so we're grateful to you, to Senator Hatch and the Foundation, as kind of your inaugural event to address this fundamental topic. Being a relative newcomer to the Salt Lake area, or to the Utah area, many years in Washington, D.C., we developed a great interfaith relationship out there, where we would come together to articulate our views collectively. But I think there's also a model from the interfaith perspective that can help us in broader society as we grapple with some of these questions. As Leonard spoke of earlier, it's become fashionable as our society evolves and changes that we need to be on the forefront of helping others understand that in society generally we agree on 90% of everything. We can resolve some of our difference in a very respectful, compatible way where we respect all interest in the process of protecting, particularly in our case, the religious liberty interests.
Thank you. Neil, talk a little about your temple and the kind of community support you received, and what a beautiful temple it is in the Salt Lake area. Yeah.
So many people who helped us over the years. The growing Hindu community of the Utah pursued bringing a temple in Utah to practice the religion, cultural activities, and we did the fundraising. We had volunteer construction, along with the regular construction force helping us. And it took us about 8 years to move from the temporary abode we had with the deity. When we started the full-fledged project in 1995, a neighbor of one of our founding trustees made connection with the president, Gordon B. Hinckley, of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. Public relations officers from there talked to us, and they gave us considerable input, including a donation to follow. Our Muslim friends who were initiating Khatija Mosque around the same time, they gave us a lot of other legal input to us, what has to be taken care of. The Sikhs and Jains, other religions, they also participate with us. The local media, Salt Lake Tribune, Desert News, television stations, were helpful in disseminating positive news about our faith and our efforts. Our LDS neighbor, suggested where we can go buy the land and build the temple. The cultural wing of our temple, India Cultural Center, benefited from one of our lifetime trustees, corporate friends. One of them includes Scott Anderson, and Senator Hatch was one of our guests of honor during our fundraising in year 2000 for our cultural center. We have also had few good men in the city of South Jordan who helped us getting the permit to construct the temple. And a local law firm provided pro bono help to establish our rights in getting the right of way. These are all community help. Without the community help, we wouldn't be here. Because faith is, everybody has faith. They want to practice their faith. They allowed us to practice our faith, to live and let live.
I love that message, that it was a community effort. It wasn't just specific to one church, one religion.
No.
But it was everyone helping.
Everyone helping. And
wonderful.
Then, during 2003, when we started the construction, our local church ward sent 40 volunteers to help in landscaping for 3 weekends. So there's another community help we had. And our temple expansion, by the still growing Hindu community and rededication. We call it Kumbhabhishekam in 2015. Received felicitations from several local religious leaders and elected officials who believe in religious liberty. Our Jewish friends were our photographers for the 3-day event. Each year we participate in the Interfaith Roundtable open houses and sacred music evening programs held in the Mormon Tabernacle. Our temple is open to all 7 days a week and is in the city of 3 temples. That's in South Jordan. It's got 2 LDS temples and 1 Hindu temple. Our governor's first inauguration in 2013 was invoked with a Hindu prayer. The person was my wife who did that. We have visits by local children coming in busloads, learning world religions. So there's another practice Utah has, teaching about world religions in all schools and colleges. Our temple architecture and sculptures are an enhancement to the art world of Utah cities. And finally, I want to say Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Let there be peace.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Pamela.
When I first came to Utah, it was only then that I realized how large the Church of Jesus Christ was. And that if you weren't a member, you weren't involved in a lot of activities that happened in your neighborhood. They had ward parties, ward dinners, ward this. But over the years, I've noticed the change. And now I get flyers on my doorstep that say, please come to the neighborhood ice cream social. Please come to the neighborhood dinner. It's become much more inclusive. I have a very curious mind, and so I found out a great deal about the Church of Jesus Christ. Excuse me, I'm going to make that error. But I also wanted to find out about other faiths here in Utah. I sometimes play hooky from my Presbyterian church, and I go to the to the Calvary Church. Many of you know Pastor Franz Davis. And at the Calvary Baptist Church, I have learned to stand and sing and clap and sway all at the same time, multitasking. But I love the warmth of the Baptists. They greet you when you come in, and you immediately feel part of their family. But I visited many of the other faiths as well. And it's been great through the Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable to see more and more people of diverse faiths and beliefs coming together and sharing with one another and feeling very comfortable about it. One of my other roles here in Utah is I work as an advisor to Governor Gary Herbert. We have one of the greatest governors, I think, in the United States. And I go to his leadership meetings and strategy meetings. And one day after a leadership meeting, he said, Pamela, I don't know as much about other faiths. He's a member of the Church of Jesus Christ. And he said, I'd really like to learn more. So he said, I want you to set up a luncheon with diverse faiths at the mansion. And this year, we will be having an interfaith luncheon with the governor, number 7. And my job is to invite faith leaders of different faiths and diverse, geographically diverse gender-wise, but also diverse, faith-wise. And it is absolutely wonderful to see how people interact from the different faiths together. Admittedly, I seat people very deliberately. I do not seat people with other faith leaders who know each other. But there's a lot of business cards being handed out. There's a lot of sharing. And those friendships continue well after the luncheon. But I've learned a great deal about so many different faiths. Sometimes I feel a little bit Baptist, a bit Presbyterian, of course. I feel a little bit Jewish. I feel a little bit Methodist. I've just learned so much and incorporated so much. When I first met Rabbi Zippel and his father, Rabbi Benny Zippel, Rabbi Benny said, "Pamela, I do not shake hands with women." And I was really taken aback, and I thought, that's hard for me. I love shaking hands and touching people and hugging people. And he explained why, and then I read up on it more. And now I am very comfortable with the rabbi doing this, and I'm not offended because I learned and understand the culture and their religious beliefs and why they believe as they do. And for the diversity that we have here in Salt Lake and in Utah, it's becoming more and more evident that we have many more similarities. And then if we take those similarities, the differences, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, do take care of themselves. And we can enjoy wonderful events. We can enjoy wonderful conversations. And I may think, well, they think very differently from me. But as I've opened my mind and listened very carefully, I thought, that's okay. I can be friends with this person, even though we have some differences. But look at the many similarities that we have in the very different faiths.
So, hearing Pamela talk about her social and worship experiences, and we think about the community service that she's involved in, can you all think of some of your own experiences that have brought you together? Because, Pamela, when we were talking about this, she said, I have been playing hooky, and I've got to get back to my church because she's been off in so many other congregations, and such an example of, and she has said, and I agree, that as we become a part of the community where it's no longer a ward party but a neighborhood party, that we all look out for one another. And that is, in essence, protecting religious liberty. Right? Aves.
So I grew up in Davis County, and I'm of Pakistani descendants. And so growing up there, there was a huge, I was a huge minority. So I went to Davis High School, and there was 1,000 people in my graduating class, and I was one of 8 minorities and only 1 Muslim. So I had to really, reflect on why I believed what I believed and who I was. And at that time, a lot of my Mormon friends, they thought that they were a majority religion in the world. So they were looking at me and saying, oh, this Muslim thing, what are you guys? They had no idea that, we believe in Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. They had no idea that Surah Maryam, or the chapter of Mary, is a chapter in the Quran. So as I went through that experience, right, and as I became friends with so many people from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they became my brothers, I had a hard time looking as this us and them kind of worldview. And what I'd like to say is, first of all, thank you, Senator Orrin Hatch, for having this event. And we, as leaders of our various communities, we can go out and help kind of break this us and them lens. And in a world where everything is going towards technology and words like algorithm and artificial intelligence is what everybody's looking at, I think there's so many simple things that we can do to kind of break those connections, right? Like in our tradition, someone went and asked one of our teachers, and he said, my community is very broken. There's a lot of misunderstanding. And how can from our tradition, how can I break this? And he was expecting some, very, philosophical, very poignant answer. And he said, the teacher said, learn how to make very good tea, right? Just go out and meet with your neighbors, go out and spend time with other folks. And what will happen is there was a research study done that they said 70% of people that have never met a Muslim, they have an unfavorable opinion of them. And 70% of the people that have met a Muslim, they have a favorable opinion for them. So sometimes I think we get very caught up in these very complicated solutions to these problems, and I think we can make a lot of strides with some of these simple solutions that are in all of our traditions.
Avais, while we have you, can you shed light on how the Muslim community was treated by the general public and even the government, for example, after 9/11, and then compare that to the recent tragic event in New Zealand, how if things had changed in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of a segue from the story that I talked to you about, right? So originally, my father, he was a professor in Nigeria, and he in the 70s, where they had discovered oil, and he worked there for about 8 years, and he wanted to go back to Pakistan and retire. So he went back to Pakistan shortly after I was born, and he lost a lot of his money based because of corruption and other things that were happening in that at that time. And what happened is he had a diplomatic passport, and so he had been to countries all across the world, and he found that America, or the United States of America, had very, very similar ideals and beliefs on that he felt like kind of personified his own, right? So when he came here and we grew up in the way that I kind of mentioned to you, right? After this 9/11, it was kind of a discovery, right? People said, hey, this happened, what is Islam, right? And so those same LDS friends that I had, now they had traveled across the world in missions, which I applaud that tradition, and they had met so many Muslim people. And so they called me back saying, oh, just kidding, we're the minority, right? So they said, hey, thank you, like they appreciated our relationship, and we started keeping more in contact. So even out of such a horrific event, right, the reaction of people was starting to get to know each other. So what happened is a year and a half ago, one of my dear friends and mentors, Khosrow Samnani, he had this idea of the Utah Muslim Civic League. So what we did was there's about 60,000 Muslims in the valley, and over 120 different countries. And what's happened is, as they've came here, a lot of them have been refugees. So they've started making these different centers, right, based on their language, or so it's easy for them to understand. So they feel, very kind of disconnected. And so we thought that it would be great to have a platform where we connected those people, and we helped we helped overcome some of the barriers that they had to get civically involved. So we did that, and it was very successful, right? So, some of the stuff that I'll also go into later when I have the chance is that they felt they had the story of their vote didn't count, or that it didn't matter. So luckily we were able to change some of that and develop a lot of relationships with the community leaders, with the faith leaders, and the political leaders. So now fast forward to this tragedy that happened in New Zealand, right? So instead of people calling and saying, what is Islam and, what's going on, we had a very opposite reaction, right? We had folks call us, whether it was people from the Church of the Latter-day Saints, or if we had the Hindu community or any of the communities. They called and said, look, we're not calling because we're the mayor. We're not calling because we're the head of the FBI. We're calling because we're your friends. We know you. We care about your community, right? So we had over 20 different officials show up on that day, and personally texting and calling me, over the night and in the morning. So I think the key takeaway from all that is that the relationship building that we did on both sides, right? When these incidences were not happening, as they happened, and as we're having more problems in the future, there's going to be this trust built. And Franklin Covey has a really good talk called The Speed of Trust, right? And he talks about how Warren Buffett doesn't really use many attorneys in his deals, right? He doesn't use them because people trust what he's going to say. So he saves millions of dollars and a lot of bureaucracy, right? And so I kind of noticed that in this instant where we had this trust built, and it wasn't having to call people up and explaining to them that this is who we are, this is what we're about. All of that red tape was cut, and we were just dealing with our brothers and friends.
Thank you for that. Rabbi Zippel, can you talk to us just on a different subject, but it's very similar, talking about the rising tide of anti-Semitism, and what can we, and some of the hostilities that we've seen toward your faith and others, what can we do to be more mindful, or what can we do to stop this violence?
Thanks, Matt. I want to kind of just echo for a second before I address the question, my appreciation towards the foundation and towards our presenters. And I must say, Senator Hatch, being a lifelong Utahn, it's actually a little bit disconcerting sitting over here with a microphone and seeing you in the audience. It's a little bit weird, I'll be honest. It takes a little bit of getting used to.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, but on the topic of anti-Semitism and hostilities towards minorities, a lot of what our presenter spoke about this morning really was powerful for me. My parents have been here now for 27 years, and on the topic of religious liberty, it's kind of interesting to see some of the two realities of religious liberties, that the challenges that they went through when they moved here, and kind of what my generation goes through. So in 1993, my parents had been here for a year. They wanted to put up a menorah downtown, a public menorah in honor of Hanukkah. And this was in the height of it all. The ACLU threatened to sue, and it became this whole song and dance about religious liberty, et cetera, and the state was amazing, and the city was amazing, and Mayor Corradini back in the day was amazing, and the menorah went up, and I think about that now because in my generation, putting up menorahs in public places, there's a beautiful one that goes up every year now outside of Bravenel Hall on county property. It's such a foregone conclusion in a certain sense, and that's not our battle. But I think that the battle that we do have in today's day and age, and the challenge of religious liberty, and especially as that ties into trends in anti-Semitism, et cetera, I think it focuses on a different dynamic, which some of our earlier presenters spoke about, and it's something which has really, rung home very personally for me very recently. So I was raised here in Salt Lake, and for me, my entire life was one, I knew no other reality than looking very different than anybody else that I knew in my little bubble. I wore a kippah and the tzitzis and the fringes, and I looked different. And that was something which I knew no other reality. And so, the stares in the supermarket and the fact that people do a double take when they see you in public, it was par for the course. And it wasn't something which was surprising to me because it was, again, the only life that I knew. About a little over 2 months ago, I made the decision to speak out publicly about being a survivor of sexual abuse. And it was a decision which came with a lot of contemplation because, as any survivor will tell you, there's this thought process: what will people think about you with this information? So that you're an observant Jew, that they can stomach, but you really tend to worry about when people have this information, when people know this about this very private part of your life, how does that influence and how does that color the way they see you and the way they think about you? And I came to a place where I was comfortable with that, and I was ready to kind of accept people's reactions come what may. And so I did that, but it gave me such interesting perspective into the fact how concerned we are about how people view us due to any sort of characteristic in our life, but how that's also a double-edged sword. What are the initial thoughts that we think about, that cross our minds when we see somebody else that has a different lifestyle than our own, that may have had a different childhood than our own, that believes in a different faith than our own, that does something different than our own life? We spend so much time obsessing about what are people going to think about me, and I think that it gives us a lot of perspective of how do I think about others. I'm all concerned about, when people know this about me, how will that color their perception? But what's my perception? What's my perception when I know that somebody else, has a different sexual orientation, or somebody else has made a different set of choices in their life, et cetera, et cetera? What are the initial thoughts that go through my head? And I think that as a community, not as lawmakers and not as policymakers, but as human beings, when we speak about the idea of religious liberty and combating, rising trends in anti-Semitism and hostilities towards other minorities, it really starts with us, and it really behooves us to really take into account the way we view other people and how that, affects our initial reaction to them and how and kind of the feeling that we give them. And I want to conclude with a very interesting anecdote. We speak about religious liberty, and there's this very diverse panel. For those of us who are locals, will know that there's one religion, in a certain sense, one belief that unites all Utahns, regardless of whatever God they pray to. And it's a very holy season for that religion, and that's actually the Jazz. I don't know how vast the fandom is here, but the playoffs are starting on Sunday. And so on a serious note, I don't know how many of you actually came across, it was published in a sports publication, but it was one of the most powerful articles I've read recently. And so this past week, one of the Jazz players, Kyle Korver, wrote an op-ed about his kind of feelings towards privilege, being a white man in the United States, and with the recent events that had taken place at the Jazz game. And he started with such a powerful story. For those of you who have read it, you'll have to forgive me. I want to share it again because it struck such a chord with me. So he shares the story how 3-4 years ago he was playing in Atlanta, and the team had a back-to-back. So they played a game at home in Atlanta, and they flew into New York City, and they were going to play the next night in New York City. And the morning of the second game, the whole team woke up to the news that one of their teammates had gone out to a club last night, had gotten arrested, spent the night in jail, and this whole kind of thing had happened. And the teammate, who by a stroke of providence actually also plays for the Jazz now, had his leg broken by the cops, by the NYPD in this altercation in a club, and it began this whole saga. And so he shares first person how sorry he feels, because when he heard that news, that his teammate, who is of African descent, is an African American, had been out late at night in a club in New York City and had gotten arrested and spent the night in jail, the first thing that came to his mind is, why was he out late at night, and what had he done to bring this on his head? Not for a second realizing the dynamics of what it means for a black man to go out at night in New York City and may not feel welcome at a certain establishment, and the whole set of events that led up to this. And he writes this op-ed hoping to kind of atone for the mindset that he had shown 4 years ago, experiencing how inherent bias was the first thing that came to his mind. So you hear that this happens to your teammate. Well, why is the guy out at night? What did he do that might have brought this upon his head? And really kind of, the repentance that he wants to show for that. And it was so powerful for me. Really it shows us, I think, the best way to combat any sort of these, hostilities towards any human being in the world is really by taking a look at our own perspective and how we view any single human being in the world. And I know a lot of what Dr. King has shared has been shared today, and I see Dr. King's quote up on the wall. But, my favorite quote from Dr. King is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And so, if we view any other human being in a certain light, that really is the beginning of the path and paves the way for being able to tackle this on a global level.
Wow, thank you. And Pamela.
Thank you for sharing that story. Baroness, you mentioned this morning, you were articulated very well about human dignity. And I was reminded of that again recently as I work with my homeless friends. One man, Peter, said he was from New York and he had been here for a year. And he said that I was the first person to touch him and shake his hand. He had not been touched in a year, and he said, when people walk past me, they avert their eyes. And so it's like I don't exist. And I was thinking about that this morning. The reason I was late, as Matt said, about a year and a half ago, one of the business people that I know well said, Pamela, you need to do something about the spiritual component of your homeless friends' lives. I mean, I know you pray for them, but what are you doing? Are you doing devotional? And I had to honestly say no. So I convened a group of diverse faith leaders, and every Thursday morning I go down to the Wigan Day Centre and set up the chairs in a semicircle and have a different faith leader come, and he does or she does a 10 to 15 minute devotional. And I partner with Catholic Community Services. We provide burritos and bagels and cream cheese and orange juice. And food is very important. Half the people who come eat the food and leave. The other half stay. And we had 39 people who stayed this morning. The feedback I'm getting from my homeless friends and through this devotional is the fact that it makes them feel important. There's the human dignity aspect there, and they have diverse conversations. They're from diverse backgrounds, and when the faith leader, the pastor, involves them and includes them and engages them, we have some of the most interesting discussions, and they have a lot of questions, but they also have a lot of the answers. But a lot of what they say involves how they're being treated by people that they say they think they're Christians, but the way they treat us, we don't think they are. And it is this issue of human dignity, this issue of everybody being equal. With refugees with whom I work through CCS and the IRC, when they tell me how they're being treated and discriminated against, I cry. It is overwhelming to me, and to think that Utahns would treat our refugee friends with anything but dignity. We are all equal in life. We have different roles to play, I agree. But if we all play those roles, that's what brings the team together. As some of you know, my favorite acronym is TEAM, team. And together, everyone achieves more. Through different faith groups, we're finding out we're able to reach more people. Several years ago, we became alarmed at the number of suicides taking place in Utah. And we decided to start a group for the prevention of suicide, an interfaith group. And we talked to the Church of Jesus Christ, and they made it clear they would love to be involved with us. They didn't want to take charge, though. So there were four of us who are founders of this group. There were four of us who are founders of this group, that's right. And we invited people from different faiths. And next Tuesday, we're having an interfaith summit on the prevention of child abuse. One of our Muslim leaders, the Imam from West Valley, he was a member of our group. And the day after our first planning meeting, he went back, and on the Friday, in the time of prayer in the mosque, he talked about child abuse, how prevalent it was, and how we must prevent it. And he was absolutely astounded at how many people came up to him afterwards. And he called me that evening and said, Pamela, what's the next step I need to take in helping my congregation? We also have an interfaith group working together on the prevention of suicide. And how do we prevent it? And how do we respond to it? And it was such a successful summit. We've been asked to do another larger one. And as we're looking at the issues of working together, treating one another with dignity, respecting the diverse beliefs, faiths, and culture, we're finding that we're making progress and we're having quantifiable outcomes from all of these different meetings, but it takes working together and respecting the rights of everyone of different faiths.
Elder Gerard, a lot of folks, some people don't even think that religious freedom is threatened at this point in our culture and our society. They lean on the fact that we have the First Amendment. What's the problem? And so, from your church's perspective, why do you all care so much, and what's the concern? We have the Constitution. We listened, obviously, to what Leonard Leo had to say, but in your world, in your church, what gives?
Well, I think, Matt, there are a number of challenges out there. I know some people believe that it's a matter of constitutional protection, that's adequate, but we see, as I mentioned earlier, and I was touched by Leonard's comments, society evolves and changes. There's, if you will, increasing tension or friction that's created between some of those established, well-understood rights and others. As the rabbi talked about, I was touched by, how do we find that common interest? I shouldn't say we have, generally they've coined the phrase now, fairness for all. How do we find that balance, whereas the Baroness talked about the true definition of philanthropy as love of mankind, as the professor talked about human dignity. So when we look at those two together, we believe that should undergird or frame, if you will, how we protect the religious liberty interest in our society today as other tensions mount, as we seek to bless all mankind and give all mankind equal dignity, equal protection, equal respect, or however we may want to define it. I was also touched by Leonard's comment today, which I think is very real, and it goes back to all the great work Senator Hatch has done. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act. There are proposals before the Congress to significantly limit that or to perhaps change it dramatically. That's not insignificant. If you will, we found balance in some of these different areas or rights. We've got to establish that with mutual understanding and respect for each other. Leonard talked about the fashionable nature as our society evolves. So we've got to be vigilant and diligent in coming together, but also, as Pamela spoke, get into these communities where we learn each other's interest. We come to know each other. From our vantage point, service is the key to all of that, because we do respect human dignity. We acknowledge people, the love of mankind, true philanthropy for who they are. So we think there are challenges out there. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's something you can't rest on. As Leonard talked about, there's some people who would like to define religious liberty in a much narrower way than it has been historically as protected under the Bill of Rights. So yes, we do think there's a challenge before us. We should come together with common interest, but we should also get into the broader community to express our concern and see if we can't find a mutually respectful way, a fairness for all, to resolve some of these challenges.
Excellent. Anyone like to add on to that? Neil?
I just have a general comment. People have different faiths. We all like different colors. Nobody denies that. We all appreciate differences in nature. So having differences is not uncommon. So we should appreciate it and enhance our lives with that differences.
Thank you for that. Baroness Nicholson, you've been interested in the journey from persecution to inclusion. What do you believe are the most important components of that journey? In other words, what do we need to do?
Thank you very much. It's a privilege and a pleasure to listen to the other participants of the panel. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. I'm working, as you were saying, on religious persecution, not on religious tolerance, which I think is too soft. It's actually persecution that is going on. And it's persecution, I mentioned the wonderful people, the Yazidis, some of the quietest and most peaceful of people who've been aggressed and destroyed, almost destroyed. But I could quote and mirror that experience with a number of other countries where it's going on at this very moment, and where the victims, therefore, are left isolated and lost. So I am a politician, and modern politicians make laws. So inevitably, I think about the gaps in legislation. And one of the gaps in countries such as this, the ones that have these persecutions going on today, I can name a dozen, sadly, they are likely to lack legal recognition of the persecuted minorities. For example, I've been concentrating on Iraq, but I'll give other examples as well. In Iraq, for example, you cannot be a Jew. The Constitution excludes the Jew. So it's a clear example of the necessity to have a recognition that you actually exist, a recognition of identity. I've been mentioning identity this morning, and it's much more important to identity than just knowing who you are. It has to be others who recognize that you actually exist at all. A second example, next door in Afghanistan, where females do not know, it's the only place in the globe, who their fathers are. They have been denied even that essential recognition of a personal identity, let alone a legal one. If you look into Pakistan, for example, and I'm just picking these countries at random, almost every country has some example where there is this sort of behavior, which is most countries. There's another variant of Islam, which is Ahmadiyya. And the Ahmadiyya, which mirror almost precisely, in my understanding, the version of Islam practiced by the Omanis, for example. In Pakistan, the Ahmadiyya do not have recognition as citizens. They're only allowed to do menial jobs. They're not allowed to use certain words and phrases. They can't use the term praise to God, for example. And I can give you these examples. I'm merely picking these countries because they're top of mind at the moment. We're debating them in the House of Lords, for example. But I'm sorry to say they're everywhere. So I say, as a politician, the first step is to look at the identity problem and to make absolutely sure that you do everything you can to get this minority, it's likely to be a minority, recognized in law, recognized so they can stand for Parliament, so they can stand for Congress, so they can stand for election, even the local council, and they don't have to have reserved positions. Reserved positions are better than nothing, but they're not real identity. They're just a sop to Cerberus. If you remember, Syl went on biting people at the mouth of hell, even whatever you threw into his jaws to keep him quiet. So I think that's incredibly important. Those are the countries that are persecuting. But if I look at us, countries who are said not to be persecuting, the countries who have placed themselves self-placed on the side of being the goodies, as it were, self-placed on the side of being the rescuers, well, we also have a problem. We also have a job to do. So many elections I've been to where we have monitored, but all we're really interested in is going in for half an hour and looking at a ballot box or two, and then disappearing again and saying that it was a free and fair election. Because that suits maybe our national position or our government's position. That allows the World Bank to give a larger loan or to give a bigger guarantee. So that exemplifies the strengthening of what is likely to be a wholly undemocratic government. So we have a lot of work to do as well. This is not a one-sided problem. It is two-sided. It's the same coin.
Thank you for that. Avais and Rabbi.
So Baroness hinted on the word religious tolerance, right? And so one of my teachers was saying how we have to change that word. So to me, tolerance is like you tolerate a bad smell or you tolerate something foul, right? All these traditions that we're talking about are full of beauty. So we as a community need to come up with something, with some better vernacular to address that. Now, the second thing as he was talking made me think was my teacher told me that if you want to eradicate fascism, you have to educate people. If you want to eradicate racism, you travel, right? And to the same, in the same breath, people that, like she mentioned some countries which happen to be majority, or very Islamic. So we as faith leaders, we have to actually look and we have to educate people what our tradition really is. So I was actually reading this earlier, and I took a screenshot from my phone. But the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he wrote a letter to the Christian monks, and this is an excerpt from it, and it says, "This is a letter which was issued by Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the messenger, the prophet, the faithful, who is sent to all the people as a trust on the part of God to all his creatures, that they may have no plea against God hereafter. Verily God is omnipotent, the wise. This letter is directed to the embracers of Islam as the covenant given to the followers of Jesus the Nazarene in the east and the west, the far and the near, the Arabs and the foreigners, the known and unknown. This letter contains the oath given unto them, and who disobeys that which is therein will be considered a disbeliever and a transgressor to that whereunto he is commanded. He will be regarded as one who has corrupted the oath of God, disbelieved his testament, rejected his authority, despised his religion, and made himself deserving of his curse, whether he is a sultan or any other believer of Islam. Whenever Christian monks, devotees, and pilgrims gather together, whether in a mountain or a valley, or den, or frequented place, or, hang on a second here. Or plain, or church, or the houses of worship. Verily, we are the back of them, and shall protect them, and their properties, and their morals. By myself, by my friends, by my assistants, for they are of my subjects under my protection. I shall exempt them from that which may disturb them, of the burdens which are paid by others as an oath of allegiance. They must not give anything of their income, but that which pleases them. They must not be offended or disturbed, or coerced or compelled. Their judges should not be changed or prevented from accomplishing their offices, nor the monks disturbed in exercising their religious order, or the people of seclusion be stopped from dwelling in their cells." So this goes on, but my point is that in our tradition, this is the core of our tradition. But we as faith leaders in all of our tradition, we have to educate our people so that these misunderstandings can be eradicated.
Thank you. Rabbi Zippel.
I just wanted to touch on the idea of persecution, which the Baroness mentioned, because I think for my faith, it's something which is, we have a very, very vast history, and as things change, I think things tend to fall out of perspective. And so I shared with Matt last week, after the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh back in October, we had a vigil shortly thereafter at our synagogue, and it was remarkably attended, and I think that evening was really a role model for what a beautiful, dynamic community can look like. But there was a member of the press who came to the vigil and asked me on camera, "Rabbi, would you comment on this new phenomenon of anti-Semitism?" And so I told her, I said, with all due respect, that's inaccurate. The idea of this new phenomenon of anti-Semitism is about as old as Semitism. From the days when we had a faith, there were those who persecuted us. And what's interesting now is because I think for the most part, as the Jewish nation, persecution is not really part of our experience anymore. I think on a personal level, so my wife's grandmother, may she live and be well, she just turned 91. When I say she ran for her life, in communist Russia in the 1930s and 40s, she literally ran for weeks on end, barefoot through snowy fields. Her father had been snapped up by the authorities for the crime of spreading Judaism, and so she and her siblings and her mother were just kind of fleeing from one barn to the next. And that was the life she knew, and now, you fast forward 2 generations later, and now, her granddaughter's husband is invited by a United States senator to sit on a panel and discuss faith and diversity. And so the idea of persecution, which is so much part of our path for thousands of years throughout our history, thankfully now is not a reality in that sense in most parts of the world. I mean, we live in countries like the United States and throughout Europe, which, although Europe is seeing some troubling trends, but for the most part, we have the ability to openly and freely practice our religions. However, and I think going to what Elder Gerard said, I think that should not, it should keep us constantly vigilant of the realities of religious acceptance. So yes, now we can openly practice our faith, but there's still so much work to be done in the arena of religious tolerance and religious acceptance and embracing the diversity that comes in these countries that we can now fortunately call home. Though persecution is no longer part of our past, we can practice openly and freely, we still need to make the efforts to make sure that our religion is something which we can practice freely, and other religions is something that we can practice freely, and that's, that behooves us as faith leaders, it behooves us as policymakers. But going back to what Avi said, and I love the line, it also behooves us to learn how to make tea. And, and though our faith is not something under threat, others are. And so go out there and have those conversations and learn how others who do not have that ability anymore, who don't have the same ability as you, how you can best be of service to them.
Thank you for that. Baroness.
A difficult question. Is that possible? Coming from a family that heavily supported the Balfour Declaration and would do the same again, how far is it possible for you to, while forgiving the past, how far is it possible for you, while remembering it, to try to forget it, so that the Jew is not burdened, as you have already just this minute declared, by this horrible burden of the past? How far is it seen as right for you to be able to recall but still forget?
There was a gentleman in our community, some of you may have known him, I know he did a little bit of work in the interfaith community, who passed 2 weeks ago. His name was Abe Katz. I know Pamela had met him on several occasions. So he was a survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald. Remarkable human being. It's a huge loss to our community. I know he lectured widely. He was the oldest and, as far as I know, most prominently known survivor here in the state. And so I shared shortly after his passing, I wrote a little piece about it, that the most amazing thing that I heard from Abe Katz, this is a man with a remarkable story. In addition to his survivor, he came to this country barely with the shirt on his back. I mean, calling what he wore on his back a shirt would be generous. Didn't know the language, had no money, and he made a life for himself, and he has the most remarkable story. All of that being said, the most remarkable thing that I would hear from Abe regularly whenever he spoke about his past, and he would develop this very steely resolve in his eyes when he would say it, he would always say, "You cannot live with hate in your heart." Which, I know I'm a rabbi, as Matt mentioned, for young people, the most entitled generation in the world, who, bear resentment and hate and all sort of that thing for failing a job interview, and who are just, some of the most, meet the most bitter yet successful people who just have that resentment. It's part of our history to keep it going. It's the way we're wired, and I don't know how it is that we just come to that, but you mentioned the Balfour Declaration, and you mentioned our history as a state, etc. I'm not quite sure how it happens, and I'm not quite sure what the method is and how that happens, but we have this inherent need, this inherent quality, characteristic, whatever you'll call it, to, in a certain sense, forget the injustices and forge ahead and try to create a better path and learn from those injustices that were perpetrated towards us into learning from those mistakes and being a better society. And so, I think it's something which is important and you give the example of the Balfour Declaration, when Israel became a state, to remember, all of that had happened leading to that event, and to make sure that they would be at the forefront of making sure that those injustices are not perpetrated against anybody else. And that's a constant battle, and one that I wouldn't say everyone's always successful at, but that's the responsibility, I think, that our people have carried with them for thousands of years, is not to live with hate in your heart. It is to move on. It is to, with a healthy measure of forgetting and not bearing resentment, to try to be that light unto the nations while not bearing that grudge. So it's not easy, but somehow, some way, we figured out a way to do it.
Leonard, when we talk about religious liberty, a lot of people put their trust in the judiciary to protect those rights. Compared to the other branches of government, is this a short-sighted or dangerous view?
I think the way to think about it maybe is to say that the courts are a necessary institution in defense of freedom of religion, but not sufficient. So it is part of the structure. It's our insurance policy, if you will, when other government actors fall by the boards and don't do what they're supposed to do. And in more recent American history, the courts have been very important in that regard, because we have had some problems with legislatures and with the executive branch. So, but you're quite. I mean, your question obviously suggests that the courts are not ultimately going to save you if you have if the political institutions are not attuned to the defense and preservation of religious freedom. The best way to think about that is to look at other countries and to see how things degraded there. So when I was on the Religious Freedom Commission, I think we visited 40-some countries around the world, and we saw an interesting set of evolutionary trends. I mean, there were some countries that were what I would call your historical abusers, right? Those were the ones that had legislative pronouncements like the ones you mentioned. These people, we don't recognize them as citizens. They don't get certain jobs or benefits, from the government. States, what I call state-sponsored persecution, right? That's the old-fashioned brand of religious suppression, right? Then you had this sort of other brand, which was what I would call exportation of extremist ideology, what you see a lot out of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. So trying to sort of inculcate the wrong values in other countries. Those are problems that are very much the result of bad legislatures, bad parliaments, bad executives. The third problem was the one that was most on the rise when I was on the commission, and that was impunity, and it was especially a problem in Pakistan, where basically the state would just stand by and watch vigilantes persecute religious minorities, and nothing would be done about it. Those are all problems that at the end of the day really aren't going to get solved simply by having the right courts. If you don't have political leadership that helps to sort of create the right social and cultural conditions, you're going to be lost. So, in the United States right now, the courts are really at the center of it. Legislatures from time to time have stepped in, RFRA being a very good example, where I think there were enough people in political society that thought the court kind of got it wrong, and so the legislature stepped in. But we should be mindful of the fact that if religious harmony and radical secularism really continue to become more serious problems in our country, the court's not going to be where the remedies are going to exist. We're going to have political institutions stepping in and doing the right thing, or we're going to see some really serious problems that this country to date has not seen.
While I have you there, keep the microphone on. I wanted to ask you about efforts to pack the courts. This is an issue that is not old, it's not new, but it's something that's come to light just recently. Walk us through what that is and how packing courts could impact religious liberty down the road.
Well, court packing refers to this idea that when you're not happy with the majority of our U.S. Supreme Court, you just throw some more people on it, hoping that you can change the balance of power on the court.
Do you need a constitutional amendment for it?
You don't. That's the interesting thing. There's only really been one other instance in American history where this idea got serious attention, and that was Franklin Roosevelt. He dangled the suggestion. It ended up not having to go very far along because one of the justices on the court started voting in the president's direction. It was called the switch in time that saved 9. And so we really weren't confronted with a serious all-out legislative battle over court packing. There are a number of politicians these days who are promoting this and promoting it very seriously. What would that do to the courts and to the freedom of religion in particular? Well, I think part of the reason why people are proposing this is because they're not happy with the Supreme Court's recent trajectory on the freedom of religion. They're not happy with a Supreme Court that has been much more muscular in defending the rights of conscience. They see down the road a number of very crucial issues that have not yet been resolved by the courts. For example, Blaine amendments, which some of you may be familiar with, this idea that you can discriminate against religiously affiliated educational institutions and not provide them with the aid and accommodation you might provide secular educational institutions. They see cases like that. They see other conscience rights cases that relate to things like human sexuality still coming down the pike, and they figure by throwing 2 or 3 extra people on the court, they can tilt those decisions in a different direction. So we should, I think, be concerned both for rule of law reasons, right? You know, it's just a bad idea to think about a court as a place where you can throw these bargaining chips around. And we should also be concerned because I think this is motivated in part by an animus toward what the freedom of religion really means under our First Amendment, among other values.
Thank you. Professor Sharfs, how do we find ways to depoliticize religious freedom? For example, a generation ago, this was an issue that received broad bipartisan support. Seems as though today both parties are divided. Some are skeptical, some might be overboard, and it seems that we need to strike that balance. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks. If you don't mind, I want to just make a brief comment to something that Rabbi Zippel said, and then I'll try to answer your question. I really like your invitation to look inwards first, and using Kyle Korver as an example of that. A few years back, I was at the United Nations, and there was a speaker on a panel who was an imam, and he said that there's a story of an ambitious religious leader who said that when he was 20, what he wanted to do was change the world. And by the time he was 30, he had modified his ambition to change his country. And by the time he was 40, it was his community. And when he was 50, it was his family. and that when he turned 60, his hope was to change himself. And I'm sort of approaching that stage in life where maybe I'll start thinking about looking in the mirror and starting there. And I like that instinct a lot, because we see all kinds of problems when we look outwards. And some of it must start within each of our own hearts for these problems to be as endemic and as systematic as they are. And Pamela, I really loved your discussion of your experience working with the homeless and tying that to the concept of dignity. I was at a conference in India earlier this year, and I met a minister of the Anglican faith who has a ministry in Bangalore focusing on the poorest of the poor, and he's had people write doctoral dissertations about it, and the title of the dissertation was A Ministry of Dignity. And he liked this emphasis that we were trying to place on dignity. And I asked him a question. I said, is your ministry one of trying to restore people's dignity or getting them to recognize their dignity? And this is an old lawyer's trick that he didn't fall for. He said, of course it's both. He wouldn't answer the either or question. He said, for many of these children, having a clean toilet and a sink is a necessary precondition for them to be able to see that they are people who have dignity. And then after that has been restored, they can then come to recognize the dignity that they have. On the question of institutional protection of religious freedom, to me, what's most interesting about the last 40-year history of the United States with respect to religious freedom is how often the courts have failed to protect religious freedom and how often Congress has been willing to. RFRA, after all, was a response to a Supreme Court decision that failed to protect religious freedom of Native Americans. And this goes contrary to political science theory of why we have judicial review. Judicial review is supposed to be because the Senate, Congress are majoritarian institutions that will protect majorities but not minorities, and so we need courts to step in and protect minorities. But it wasn't courts that protected the minority, it was the Senate, and it was the majoritarian institution. And they also passed another law, the Native Americans Religious Freedom Act, which specifically addressed the question of the sacramental use of peyote. And then the Supreme Court struck down RFRA as it applied to the states, and it was once again Congress that stepped in with the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which tried to do as much as possible from the federal level to protect religious freedom. And it was states that stepped in and passed religious freedom acts. What's remarkable is that when Senator Hatch passed RFRA, it was almost unanimous. What was the final vote, Senator Hatch? 97 to 3, or 96 to 3. There might have been one person who was sick. That's amazing, right? And then who signed it? Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton was president, who signed it happily and took credit for it. But you know who else took credit for it? The ACLU, the NAACP, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, all of whom now stand opposed to RFRA because of the conflict between religious freedom and gay rights, largely. It's not just that, but it's largely that. And this gets to the question that you asked me, which is, how do we depoliticize this issue? This, more than anything else, worries me about the status of religious freedom in America today. It is a partisan issue. If you ask Democrats, as between gay rights and religious freedom, which should prevail, the vast majority say gay rights. If you ask Republicans, in a conflict between gay rights and religious freedom, which should prevail, the majority, in both cases it's like a 75% majority, will give the opposite answer and will say religious freedom. Religious freedom was not a partisan issue when the International Religious Freedom Act was passed, when RFRA was passed, when ARLUPA was passed. It is a partisan issue today. And unless we address finding a principled pluralism that vindicates both gay rights and religious rights, we're going to be in a world of hurt in our country. And it's why efforts like Fairness for All, which Elder Gerard mentioned, why this idea of human dignity for everyone everywhere is so important, because we've got to sit down and each care about each other's fears and freedoms and not just our own fears and freedoms. Because one thing that really marks our moment is fear. And I think it's everywhere. I think that the gay rights community has legitimate basis for fear. I think the religious communities have legitimate basis for fear. The sick and tireds and the left behinds, that's the coalition that I think elected President Trump, have reason for fear. And, we've got to find ways to seek solutions that are responsive to the fears, the needs, and the rights of everyone.
Thank you for that, Baroness.
Don't you think you need the Queen?
Of course.
We need all the help we can get. We need all the help we can get, and I'm happy to have the Queen's help at any time on any occasion. She's actually been a conspicuous proponent of religious freedom and of the importance of religion in not just public life, but life. And so I think that the example that she has shown personally, Charles, maybe not so much, but the Queen, I think, has actually been quite exemplary on this question.
Thank you for that. Let's have that our final word, the Queen. And thank you for all of you who participated on the panel. We've been deeply enriched and blessed in hearing your words, and I know that I can speak for all of us here. We've learned that we need to be serving others and a part of the community.